Chapter 2, Parts 4 to 8 of A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Graham Redman. A History of Greece to the Death of Alexander the Great, Volume 1, by John Bagnell Bury. Chapter 2, Part 4. Growth of Trade and Maritime Enterprise. The age of the aristocratic republics saw the face of the Greek world completely transformed. The colonial expansion of Greece eastward and westward was itself part of this transformation, but it also helped signally to bring about other changes. For, while the colonies were politically independent of their mother states, they reacted in many ways on the mother country. We have seen how the system of family property was favourable to colonial enterprise. But the colonists who had suffered under that system were not likely to introduce it in their new settlements, and thus the institution of personal land ownership was probably first established and regulated in the colonies. Their example reacted on the mother country, where other natural causes were also gradually undermining the family system. In the first place, as the power of the state grew greater, the power of the family grew less, and when the head of the state, whether king or republican government, was felt as a formidable authority, the prestige of the head of the family, overshadowed by the power of the state, became insensibly weaker. In the second place, it was common to assign a portion of an estate to one member of the family to manage and enjoy the undivided use of it, and although it did not become his and he had no power of disposing of it, yet the natural tendency would have been to allow it on his death to pass to his son on the same conditions. It is clear that such a practice tended to the ultimate establishment of personal proprietorship of the soil. Again, side by side with the undivided family estate, personal properties were actually acquired. At this period there was much wild, unallotted land, which wild beasts haunt, especially on the hill slopes, and when a man of energy reclaimed a portion of this land for tillage, the new fields became his own, for they had belonged to no man. We can thus see generally how inevitable it was that the old system should disappear, and the large family estates break up into private domains. But the change was not accomplished by legislation, and the gradual process by which it was brought about is withdrawn from our eyes. It was only when private land ownership had become an established fact that the law came in and recognized it by regulating sales of land and allowing men to bequeath it freely. The Boeotian poet Hesiod has given us a picture of rural life in Greece at this period. He was a husbandman himself near Askra, where his father, who had come as a stranger from Syme in Aeolis, had put under cultivation a strip of waste land on the slopes of Helicon. The farm was divided between his two sons Perses and Hesiod, but in unequal shares, and Hesiod accuses Perses of winning the larger moiety by bribing the lords of the district. But Perses managed his farm badly, and it did not prosper. Hesiod wrote his poem, The Works, to teach such unthrifty farmers as his brother true principles of agriculture and economy. His view of life is profoundly gloomy, and suggests a condition of grave social distress in Boeotia. This must have been mainly due to the oppression of the nobles, gift-devouring princes, as he calls them. The poet looks back to the past with regret. The Golden Age, the Silver, and the Bronze have all gone by, and the age of the heroes who fought at Troy. And mankind is now in the Iron Age, and will never cease by day or night from weariness and woe. Would that I did not live in this generation, would that I had died before, or were born hereafter." The poem gives minute directions for the routine of the husbandman's work, the times and tides of sowing and reaping, and the other labours of the field, the fashion of the implements of tillage, and all this is accompanied by maxims of proverbial wisdom. Apart from the value of his poem as a social picture, Hesiod has a great significance as the first spokesman of the common folk. In the history of Europe his is the first voice raised from among the toiling classes and claiming the interest of mankind in their lot. It is a voice indeed of acquiescence, counselling fellow toilers to make the best of an evil case. The stage of revolt has not yet been reached. But the grievances are aired, and the lords who wield the power are exhorted to deal just judgments, that the land may prosper. The new poet is, in form and style, under the influence of the Homeric poems, but he is acutely conscious that he is striking new notes and has new messages for men. He comes forward, unlike Homer, in his own person. He contrasts himself with Homer when he claims that the Muses can teach truth as well as beautiful fiction. In his other poem, the Theogony, he tells us that the daughters of Zeus taught Hesiod as he fed sheep on the hillsides of Helicon. They gave him for staff a branch of bay. The staff was now the minstrel's emblem, for the epic poems were no longer sung to the lyre, but were recited by the rhapsode, standing with a staff in his hand. Then the Muses breathed into the shepherd of Askra the wizard power of declaring the future and the past, and set him the task of singing the race of the blessed gods. In the Theogony he performs this task. He sings how the world was made, the gods and the earth, the rivers and the ocean, the stars and the heaven, how in infinite space which was at the beginning there arose earth and Tartarus, and love, the cosmic principle. And it is notable how he introduces amongst the eldest-born powers of the world such abstractions as love itself, memory, sleep. These speculations on the origin of the universe and the attempt to work up the popular myths into a system mark a new stage in the intellectual development of Greece. The Theogony produced a whole school of bards, who merged their identity under the name of Hesiod, and as we have seen, these Hesiodic poems had a decisive influence in moulding the ideas of the Greeks as to the early history of their race. Boeotia was always an unenterprising country of husbandmen, and Hesiod had no sympathy with trade or foreign venture, though his father had come from Aeolis. But the growth of trade was the most important fact of the time, and here too the colonies reacted on the mother country. By enlarging the borders of the Greek world they invited and facilitated the extension of Greek trade, and promoted the growth of industries. Hitherto the Greeks had been mainly an agricultural and pastoral people. Many of them were now becoming industrial. They had to supply their western colonies with oil and wool, with metal and pottery, and they began to enter into serious competition with the Phoenician trader, and to drive eastern goods from the market. Greek trade moved chiefly along waterways, and this is illustrated by the neglect of road-making in Greece. There were no paved roads, even in later times, except the sacred ways to frequented sanctuaries, like that from Athens to Eleusis and Delphi, or that from the sea-coast to Olympia. Yet the Greeks were still timorous navigators, and it was deemed hazardous to sail even in the most familiar waters except in the late summer. Hesiod expresses in vivid verses the general fear of the sea. For 50 days after the solstice, till the end of the harvest, is the tide for sailing. Then you will not wreck your ship, nor will the sea wash down your crew, unless Poseidon or Zeus wills their destruction. In that season winds are steady and ocean kind. With mind at rest launch your ship and stow your freight. But make all speed to return home, and await not the new wine and the rain of the vintage tide, when the winter approaches, and the terrible south wind stirs the waves, in fellowship with the heavy autumnal rain of Zeus, and makes the sea cruel. About this time, however, an important advance was made in seacraft by the discovery of the anchor. Seafaring states found it needful to build warships for protection against pirates. The usual type of the early Greek warship was the Pentaconta, or 50-oar, a long, narrow galley with 25 benches, on each of which 2 oarsmen sat. The Pentaconta hardly came into use in Greece before the 8th century. The Homeric Greeks had only smaller vessels of 20 oars, but we can see in the Homeric poems the Pentaconta coming within their ken as a strange and wonderful thing. The ocean deity Briareos, called by the name of the Aegean, appears in the Iliad, and he is probably no other than the new racer of the seas sped by 100 hands. In the Odyssey the Phaeacians, who are the kings of seacraft, have ships of 50 oars. But before the end of the 8th century a new idea revolutionized shipbuilding in Phoenicia. Vessels were built with 2 rows of benches, one above the other, so that the number of oarsmen and the speed were increased, without adding to the length of the ship. The bireme, however, never became common in Greece, for the Phoenicians had soon improved it into the trireme by the superposition of another bank of oars. [Footnote: The secret of building this kind of galley has been lost. Modern shipwrights cannot reproduce a trireme. In later times the Greeks built ships of many banks, 5, 10, even 40. End of footnote. The trireme, propelled by 170 rowers, was ultimately to come into universal use as the regular Greek warship, though for a long time after its first introduction by the Corinthians the old Pentacontas were still generally used. But the unknown shipwright who invented the bireme deserves the credit of the new idea. Whatever naval battles were fought in the 7th century were fought mainly, we may be sure, with Pentacontas, but Pentacontas and triremes alike were affected by the new invention of the bronze ram on the prow, a weapon of attack which determined the future character of Greek naval warfare. The Greeks believed that the first regular sea fight between 2 Greek powers was fought before the middle of the 7th century, between Corinth and her daughter city Corcyra. If the tradition is true, we may be sure that the event was an incident in a struggle for the trade with Italy and Sicily and along the Adriatic coasts. The chief competitors, however, with Corinth in the west, were the Euboean cities, Chalcis and Eretria. In the traffic in eastern seas, the island city of Aegina, though she had no colonies of her own, took an active part, and became one of the richest mercantile states of Greece. Athens too had ships, but her industries were still on a comparatively small scale, and it was not till a much later period that her trade was sufficient to involve her in serious rivalry with her neighbours. But the most active of all in industry and commerce were the Greeks of Ionia. End of chapter 2, part 4. Chapter 2, part 5. Influence of Lydia on Greece. The Greeks of the Asiatic coast were largely dependent, for good or evil, on the adjacent inland countries. The inland trade added to their prosperity, but at any moment, if a strong barbarian power arose, their independence might be gravely menaced. At the beginning of the 7th century active intercourse was maintained between the Greeks and the kingdoms of Phrygia and Maeonia. The Phrygian king Midas dedicated a throne to the god of Delphi, Both the Phrygians and the Lydians adopted the Greek alphabet, while the Greeks adopted their modes of music and admitted Phrygian legends into Greek mythology. A considerable Phrygian element had won its way into Lydia and had gained the upper hand. In the Homeric poems we nowhere read of Lydians, but only of Meonians, and there can be no doubt that this name represents the Phrygian settlers or conquerors. A Meonian dynasty ruled in Lydia at the beginning of the 7th century, and the king bears a Meonian name, Candoles, hound-choker. The Aryan conquerors, that is, who spoke an Aryan tongue, had occupied the throne for centuries, and Greek tradition afterwards derived the origin of the family of Candoles from Heracles himself. But they had become degenerate, and Gyges, a native Lydian of the clan of the Myrmidai, succeeded in slaying Candoles and seizing the crown. This revolution ushered in a new period for the Lydian, as it was now called, no longer Meonian, kingdom. The dominion of the Meonian sovereign had probably extended southward to the valley of the Meander. Gyges extended his power northward to the shores of the Propontis, where he founded Deucalion and conquered the Troad. But he also designed to make the Aegean his western boundary, and bring the Greek cities under his lordship. He pressed down the valley of the Hermus against Smyrna, down the valley of the Caister against Colophon, down the valley of the Meander against Miletus and Magnesia. Of these enterprises only the faintest hints have come down to us. It may be that Colophon was actually captured, and perhaps Magnesia, but the other cities beat back the enemy. The poet Mimnermus sings how a warrior, perhaps his own grandfather, wrought havoc in the ranks of the Lydian horsemen in the plain of the Hermus. But the plans of Gyges against his Greek neighbours were suddenly interrupted by a blow which descended, as it were, from the other side of the world, upon Greeks and Lydians alike. The regions round about Lake Meotis on the northern coast of the Black Sea were inhabited by the Cimmerians, who appear in the marvellous wanderings of Odysseus. They were now driven forth from their abodes, to which, however, their name clung and still clings, by a Scythian folk, the Scoloti, who came from the east. Homeless, the Cimmerians wandered to the opposite side of the Euxine, but whether they travelled by the eastern or the western route, by the Caucasus or by the Danube, is not known for certain. On one hand they seem to have appeared first in eastern Asia Minor, on the other they seem to have associated with themselves some Thracian peoples, the Triarians, Edonians, and Thynians. The truth may be that they came round by the eastern coast, and that afterwards, when they made their incursions into western Asia Minor, they invited allies from Thrace to help them. Having defeated the Milesians of Sinope, they chose this place to be their chief settlement. They ventured to attack the great Assyrian Empire, and King Esarhaddon himself tells how "I smote the Cimmerian Teucer with all his army." But they overthrew the realm of Phrygia under its last king Midas, and towards the middle of the 7th century they attacked Lydia. To meet this danger, Gyges sought help from Assyria. The warlike Esarhaddon had been succeeded at Nineveh by Assurbanipal, a peaceful and literary prince, whose refined luxury is caricatured in the Greek conception of Sardanapalus. The lord of Lydia acknowledged the overlordship of the lord of Assyria. He gained a victory over the Cimmerians, and sent their chiefs in chains to Nineveh. But he did not long brook to be the vassal of another sovereign. He threw off his allegiance to Assyria, and sent Ionian and Carian mercenary soldiers to Egypt, to help that country also to free itself from Assyrian dominion. At this moment, perhaps, Gyges was at the height of his power. His wealth was famous, and he too, like Phrygian Midas, sent gifts, among them 6 golden mixing bowls, to the Delphian god. The poet Archilochus, who witnessed his career, sings defiantly that he cares not for the wealth of golden Gyges. But the Cimmerians presently renewed their attack, and fortune changed. Gyges was slain in battle, his capital Sardis was taken except the citadel, and it was some satisfaction to Assurbanipal to record that Lydia was in the hands of the Cimmerians. It was not long before they swooped down upon the Greek cities. Calinus, a poet of Ephesus, heard the trample of their horses and roused his fellow citizens to battle. Ephesus defied their attack, but the temple of Artemis outside the walls was burned down. They and their allies from Thrace destroyed Magnesia on the Meander. The barbarians made a deep impression. The swords which they swept down upon their enemies were enormous. They were equipped with large quivers and wore the curved caps of the Scythians. Fierce hounds ran with their horses. Such was their appearance as they were portrayed by a Greek artist of a later generation on a painted sarcophagus found at Clazomene. But the danger passed away. Ardys succeeded Gyges on the Lydian throne, and he finally not only drave out the Cimmerians from the land, but perhaps succeeded in extending his power into Cappadocia as far as the Halys. In the meantime Lydia had made an invention which revolutionized commerce. It is to Lydia that Europe owes the invention of coinage. The Babylonians, Phoenicians, and Egyptians made use of weighed gold and silver as a medium of exchange, a certain ratio being fixed between the two metals. A piece of weighed metal becomes a coin when it is stamped by the state and is thereby warranted to have its professed weight and purity. This step was first taken in Lydia, where the earliest money was coined somewhere about the beginning of the 7th century, probably by Gyges. These Lydian coins were made of the native white gold, or electron, a mixture of gold and silver in which the proportion of gold was greater. A bar of the white gold of Sardis was regarded as 10 times the value of a silver bar, and 3/4 of the value of a gold bar of the same weight. [Footnote: The Lydians had 2 scales, one for domestic intercourse based on a standard which they derived from Babylonia, and one for foreign commerce based on a standard derived from Phoenicia through the Greeks. End of footnote. Miletus and Samos soon adopted the new invention, which then spread to other Asiatic towns. Then Aegina and the 2 great cities of Euboea instituted monetary systems, and by degrees all the states of Greece gave up the primitive custom of estimating value in heads of cattle, and most of them had their own mints. As gold was very rare in Greece, not being found except in the islands of Sifnos and Thasos, the Greeks coined in silver. This invention, coming at the very moment when the Greeks were entering upon a period of great commercial activity, was of immense importance, not only in facilitating trade, but in rendering possible the accumulation of capital. Yet it took many generations to supersede completely the old methods of economy by the new system. The Greeks had derived their systems of weight from Babylonia and Phoenicia, but when Aegina and the Euboean cities fixed the standard of their silver coinage, they did not adopt the silver standard of either of those countries. The heavier statia, as the standard silver coin was named of Aegina, weighed 192 grains, and slightly exceeded a florin in value, and this system was adopted throughout the Peloponnese and in northern Greece. The lighter statia of Euboea weighed 130 grains, which was the Babylonian standard of gold. This system, at first confined to Euboea, Samos, and a few other places, was adopted in the 7th century by Corinth in a modified form, and afterwards by Athens. It was highly characteristic of the Greeks that their coinage was marked from the beginning by religious associations, and it has been supposed that the priests of their temples had an important share in initiating the introduction of money. It was in the shrines of their gods that men were accustomed to store their treasures for safe keeping. The gods themselves possessed costly dedications, and thus the science of weighing the precious metals was naturally studied by the priesthoods. Every coin which a Greek state issued bore upon it a reference to some deity. In early times this reference always took the shape of a symbol. In later times the head of the god was often represented. The Lydian coins of Sardis, the coins of Miletus and other Ionian cities bore a lion. Those of Eretria showed a cow with a sucking calf. Aegina displayed a tortoise, and Cyzicus a tunnyfish. And all these tokens were symbols of the goddess who, whether under the name of Aphrodite or Hera or Artemis, was identified by the Greeks with Astarte of Phoenicia. End of chapter 2, part 5. Chapter 2, part 6. The opening of Egypt. Thus the merchants of Miletus and her fellows grew rich. They were the intermediaries between Lydia and the Mediterranean, while the Lydians carried their wares to the interior parts of Asia Minor and the Far East. Their argosies sailed to the far west as well as to the coasts of the Euxine. But a new field for winning wealth was opened to them, much about the same time as the invention of coinage revealed a new prospect to the world of commerce. The jealously guarded gates of Egypt were unbarred to Greek trade. The greatest exploit of the Assyrian monarch Esarhaddon was the conquest of Egypt. The land had been split up into an endless number of small kingdoms, and the kings continued to govern as vassals of Assyria. But the foreign domination did not last for much more than a quarter of a century. One of the kings, Psammetichus of Sais in Lower Egypt, probably of Libyan stock, revolted against Assurbanipal, who, in the last year of his reign, was occupied in subduing an insurrection of the Elamites of Susiana. We have seen how mail-clad soldiers of Ionia and Caria were sent by the lord of Lydia to assist Psammetichus. With the help of these bronze men who came up from the sea, he reduced the other kings and brought the whole of Egypt under his sway. This Libyan dynasty kept Sais as their capital, and their power was supported by foreign mercenaries, Greeks and Carians, Syrians and Phoenicians. Psammetichus built the fortress of Daphne, for so Greek speech graciously altered into Greek shape the Egyptian name Dephene, and entrusted it to his Greek soldiers. Relics of this foreign garrison have been dug up among the ruins of Daphne. Psammetichus and his successors completely departed from the narrow Egyptian policy of the pharaohs, and were the forerunners in some respects of the Greek dynasty of the Ptolemies, who 3 centuries hence were to rule the land. They opened Egypt to the trade of the world, and allowed Greeks to settle permanently in the country. Necho, the son of Psammetichus, connected the Red Sea with the Nile by a canal, and began a work which it was reserved for our own time to achieve, the cutting of a channel through the isthmus which parts the Red Sea from the Mediterranean. His war fleet sailed both in the Cypriot and in the Arabian seas, and a party of Phoenician explorers sent out by him accomplished the circumnavigation of Africa, a feat which 2,000 years later was regarded as a wild dream. The Milesians founded a factory on the western or Canobic channel of the Nile, not very far from Sais, and around it a Greek city grew up, which received the name of Naucratis, Sea Queen. This colony became the haven of all Greek traders, for though at first they seem to have moved freely, restrictions were afterwards placed upon them, and they were not permitted to enter Egypt except by the Canobic mouth. At Naucratis the Milesians, the Samians, and the Aeginetans had each their own separate quarter and their own sanctuaries. All the other Greek settlers had one common enclosure called the Hellenion, girt by a thick brick wall and capable of holding 50,000 men. Here were their market-place and their temples. All the colonists of Naucratis were Greeks of the Asiatic coast, whether Ionians, Dorians, or Aeolians, excepting alone the Aeginetans. Egypt, as we see, offered a field not only for traders but for adventurous soldiers, and thus helped to relieve the pressure of overpopulation in Ionia. At Abu Simbel in Upper Egypt we have a relic of the Greek mercenaries who accompanied King Psammetichus II, Necho's successor, in an expedition against Ethiopia. Some of them scratched their names on the colossal statues of the temple, and the very triviality of this relic at such a distance of time perhaps makes it the more interesting. End of chapter 2, part 6. Chapter 2, part 7, Cyrene. Not long after Egypt was thrown open to Greek trade, there arose to the west of Egypt a new Greek city. Civil dissension in the island of Thera between the older population, who called themselves by the obscure name of Mainyi, and the later Dorian settlers, led to an emigration of the Mainyi, some Dorians among them, and the exiles, having increased their band by Cretan adventurers, sailed for the shores of Barca. They made their first settlement on the little island of Plataea off the coast, their second on the opposite coast of the mainland, and when this too proved a failure, they founded their abiding settlement about 8 miles from the sea, near an abundant spring of water, on 2 white hills which commanded the encompassing plain. The city was named Cyrene, and it was the only Greek colony on the coast of Africa which attained to eminence and wealth. The man who led the island folk to their new home became their king. His name seems to have been Aristoteles, but he took the strange name of Battus, which is said to mean king in the Libyan language, while its resemblance to the Greek word for stammer gave rise to the legend that Battus I stammered in his speech. His son was Archesilas, and in the line of the Cyrenian kings Battus and Archesilas succeeded each other in alternation. Under Battus II the new city was reinforced by a large incoming of new settlers whom he invited chiefly from the Peloponnese and Crete, and this influx changed the character of the place, since the original Mainian element was outnumbered. The lands which the Greeks took from the Libyan inhabitants were made fruitful by the winter rains. Pindar describes them as plains over which dark clouds hover. There was excellent pasturage, and the men of Cyrene became famous for rearing horses and for skill as riders and charioteers. They were naturally the intermediaries between Greek merchants and the Libyan natives. But the chief source of the wealth of the Cyrenian kings was the export of Silphium, a plant which acquired a high repute for medicinal virtues. In those days it grew luxuriantly in the regions of Barca. Now it is extinct. The sale of Silphium was a monopoly of the king, and on a fine Cyrenian cup we can see Archesilas II himself watching the herb being weighed and packed. It was in the reign of this king that Barca was founded farther west. He quarrelled with his brothers, and they left Cyrene and founded a town for themselves. Cyrene held her head high in the Greek world, though she was somewhat apart from it. A Cyrenian poet arose and continued the Odyssey and described the last adventures of Odysseus. His poem was accepted by Greece as winding up the epic cycle which was associated with the name of Homer. His work was distinguished by local pride and local colouring. He gave Odysseus a son, Arcesilaus, and connected the royal line of Cyrene with the great wanderer. And he introduced a flavour of those Libyan influences which modified Cyrenian civilization, just as the remote cities of the Euxine received influences from Scythia. End of chapter 2, part 7. Chapter 2, part 8. Popular discontent in Greece. The advance of the Greeks in trade and industry produced many consequences of moment for their political and social development. The manufactures required labour, and a sufficient number of free labourers was not to be had. Slaves were therefore indispensable, and they were imported in large numbers from Asia Minor and Thrace and the coasts of the Euxine. The slave trade became a profitable enterprise, and the men of Chios made it their chief pursuit. The existence of household slaves, generally war captives, such as we meet in Homer, was an innocent institution which would never have had serious results. But the new organized slave system, which began in the 7th century, was destined to prove one of the most fatal causes of disease and decay to the states of Greece. At first the privileged classes of the aristocratic republics benefited by the increase of commerce, for the nobles were themselves the chief speculators. But the wealth which they acquired by trade undermined their political position. For, in the first place, their influence depended largely on their domains of land, and when industries arose to compete with agriculture, the importance of land necessarily declined. In the second place, wealth introduced a new political standard, and aristocracies resting on birth tended to transform themselves into aristocracies resting on wealth. The proverb, "money makes the man," now came into vogue. As nobility by birth cannot be acquired, whereas wealth can, such a change is always a step in the direction of democracy. On the other hand, the poorer freemen at first suffered. How heavily the transition from the old systems of exchange to the use of money bore upon them, we shall find illustrated when we come to the special history of Athens. But their distress and discontent drove them into striving for full political equality, and in many cases they strove with success. The second half of the 7th century is marked in many parts of Greece by struggles between the classes, and the wiser and better of the nobles began themselves to see the necessity of extending political privileges to their fellow citizens. The centralization in towns, owing to the growth of industries and the declining importance of agriculture, created a new town population, and doubtless helped on the democratic movement. In this agitated period lived a poet of great genius, Archilochus of Paros. It has been truly said that Archilochus is the first Greek of flesh and blood, whom we can grasp through the mists of antiquity. Son of a noble by a slave mother, he tried his luck among the adventurers who went forth to colonize Cyrus in Italy, but he returned having won an experience of seafaring which taught him to sing of the bitter gifts of Poseidon and the mariner's prayers for "sweet home." Then he took part in a Parian colonization of Thasos, and was involved in party struggles which rent the island. It must have been at Thasos that he witnessed an eclipse of the sun at noontide, which he describes, and this gives us, as a date in the Thasian period of his life, the 6th of April, 648 B.C., the first exact date we have bearing on the history of Greece. "All the evils of all Hellas are here," he exclaims, "and Thasos is not a fair place nor a desirable, like the land round the stream of Cyrus." he announces that he is the servant of the Lord of Battle, and skilled in the delicious gift of the Muses. But when he fought in a war which the Thasians waged with the Thracians of the opposite coast, he ran for his life and dropped his shield. "Never mind," he said, "I will get me another as good." Poor, with a stain on his birth, tossed about the world, soured by adversity, Archilochus in his poetry gave full expression to his feelings, and used it to utter his passionate hatred against his enemies, such as the Parian Lycambes, for instance, who refused him his daughter Neobule. Had fortune favoured him, he would have been a noble of the nobles. Ill luck drove him to join the movement against aristocracy. His poems present a complete contrast to the epic style, and even to Hesiod. He addressed himself to the people, sang to the flute instead of the lyre, used colloquial language, and perfected iambic and trochaic measures for literary purposes. His influence may be judged from the fact that his poems were recited by the rhapsodes along with Homer and Hesiod. The ills of Greece, which were reflected in the poems of Archilochus, were to lead to the development of equality and freedom. But success in the struggle would in most cases depend on military efficiency, and a revolution in the art of warfare, which was brought about at the same period, was therefore of immense importance. This takes us to the history of Sparta. End of Chapter 2, Part 8. Recording by Graham Redman.